you, Ricky. Thank you, Andrea. I have to say, while I'm really glad that there are hundreds who are joining us tonight to listen to this conversation, I have a feeling that if they're anything like me, as they've been listening to your presentation, they've been feeling their blood pressure rise as at example after example after example of the amount of hatred and animosity that's being directed at Jews and at the Jewish community. This is really chilling stuff. And if there's any silver lining in everything that we've gone through in these last 6 weeks, it's the way the Jewish community has come together virtually across the board. And in a sense, the question that I want to talk about may seem like the most obvious one of all. Is the mapping project anti-Semitic? I imagine that if we could have a show of hands, everybody who's participating in this webinar would have their hands up in the air if they were asked, do you think that it's anti-Semitic? Yes, it's anti-Semitic, but not everyone agrees. If you take a look, for example, at the website Mondoweiss, one of the most notorious anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, anti-Zionist websites, you'll find that its Jewish editors not only defend the mapping project, they promote it. They'll tell you that it's not anti-Semitic. There was a headline on Mondoweiss a few weeks ago that said, the mapping project isn't an attack on the Jewish community, it's a call to accountability. So I would say it's not enough to simply label the mapping project anti-Semitic on the assumption that all of us know in our bones when we run into it, sort of like the Potter Stewart definition of pornography. I may not be able to define it, he said, but I know it when I see it. And a lot of us, both American Jews and non-Jews alike, have a sense of when something is anti-Semitic. I think in this case, that's not enough. We need to peel back the layers of the mapping project and show the ways in which it's anti-Semitic. And there are more than just one of them. I think it's important for us to be able to explain exactly how and why it's anti-Semitic. And as I analyze it, there are 6 aspects in particular that make this nefarious mapping project classic anti-Semitism. So let me go through these one by one. Number 1, the mapping project, to say the obvious, is drenched with hatred of Israel and its supporters. In the very first line of its very first definition, it identifies Zionism, which, as you all know, is simply the right of the Jewish people to sovereignty in their own homeland, identifies it as, quote, a form of white supremacy that supports the colonization of Palestine. And it explicitly condemns any Jewish state anywhere in historic Palestine, including, it says, on land that was owned by Jews even before 1948. And considering that Jews have lived in historic Palestine for more than 2,000 years, that's going back quite a ways. Any Jewish state on any land anywhere in Palestine, according to the mapping project, is illegitimate. And I think it's important because you so often hear people say anti-Zionism is different from anti-Semitism. There was a time, maybe 70 or 80 years ago, when you could be sincerely anti-Zionist and at the same time be passionately pro-Jewish. Those days are long, long gone. When half the Jewish population in the world lives in the land of Israel, when Zionism today means sovereignty for half the world's Jews and potentially a homeland and citizenship for any Jew in trouble anywhere in the world, then when you say that you're not against Jews, you're merely against the Jewish state, or you're merely against Jewish sovereignty, that is, by definition, anti-Semitic. Historically, anti-Semitism took one of 3 forms. Going back 3,000 years, throughout the entirety of Jewish history, anti-Semitism took one of 3 forms. There was hatred of the Jewish religion. This is the classic form of anti-Semitism that we associate with the Crusades, with the medieval demands, convert or die, baptism or death. That's one, hatred of the Jewish religion. A second form of anti-Semitism has been hatred of the Jewish people. in its most horrific manifestation, this was the Holocaust. Hitler and the Nazis didn't care about your religious practice. They wanted to eliminate Jews physically. There's a third aspect of anti-Semitism that for about 1900 years went into hiatus because it became irrelevant. But it used to be very much a part of Jewish history. And beginning in the 20th century, it came roaring back into Jewish history. And that's the form of anti-Semitism that takes the form of hatred of Jewish sovereignty, meaning hatred of a Jewish state in a Jewish homeland. There's no mapping project for Ireland or China or Mexico, or for the supporters of Ireland or China or Mexico or any other country in the Boston area. It's only hatred of Israel and of Israel's supporters that the mapping project concerns itself with. By definition, that's anti-Semitic. So that's number one. Number two, the mapping project makes no distinction between Jewish and Zionist, or between American Jew and Israeli. As Andrea mentioned earlier, this is reminiscent of what Zara Ballou was quoted as saying some months ago when she did exactly the same thing. When the mapping project encourages its followers and its adherents to dismantle and disrupt institutions and organizations and cultural groups, it treats those that are focused specifically on Israel, such as the Israeli consulate, or the Israeli American Council, or the New Israel Fund, or, in a sense, CAMRA, treats them exactly the same, with exactly the same disdain and exactly the same animosity with which it treats organizations that are focused on purely local, communal affairs, such as Gann Academy, which is a Jewish day school in the Boston area, or Yachad, which is a support organization for people with intellectual disabilities, or the Synagogue Council of Massachusetts. None of those deal specifically with Israel. None of those are specifically Zionist organizations with a Zionist mission. And yet the mapping project makes no distinction between the organizations that focus on Israel and the organizations that work to serve the Jewish community locally. The mapping project doesn't only demonize Israel, it demonizes anything Jewish. That is anti-Semitic by definition. A third aspect. The mapping project makes it clear that it wants any organization in the whole greater Boston, Massachusetts area that treats Israel as something normal to be among those that are dismantled and disrupted. It includes those among those that it says wreak devastation in the world. So, for example, it doesn't focus its attack on groups only that say support Israel's settlement policy. It doesn't focus its animus on groups that oppose Palestinian statehood. It doesn't focus its animus on groups that are friendly to the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. Instead, it demonizes any entity at all that has any connection with Israel, no matter how neutral or non-political or benign. So it includes, for example, the Boston Museum of Science. Now, how in the world is the Boston Museum of Science contributing to devastation in the world, and why does the mapping project think that the Science Museum needs to be disrupted and dismantled? Well, if you read what they write, it's because 12 years ago, the Science Museum had an exhibit on new technology from Israel. Now, was that new technology military technology that somehow was involved in harming Palestinians? No, nothing like that at all. It was technology dealing with solar and wind energy and medicine and high tech. These are the kinds of things that the mapping project regards as intolerable, even though if you look for something that's specifically Zionist about it, you would be searching all day and all night. Another example, it attacks the Berklee College of Music. The Berklee College of Music. How is that an example of an organization that needs to be dismantled? Why is that an organization that has to be disrupted? Because the Berklee College of Music, which is a prominent music school in America, conducts an exchange program with the Rimon School of Music, which is a prominent school of music in Israel. Now, universities and schools all across the United States and all across the world routinely engage in exchange programs with each other. There's nothing at all political about Berklee's exchange program with the Rimon School. And yet to the Mapping Project, this is what they call, this is a quote, an attempt to positively brand Israel in order to whitewash the realities of Israel's colonial subjugation of Palestinians. No, none of this has anything to do with Palestinians. That's not what the Mapping Project is about. No matter how many times they repeat over and over again that their concern is with Palestinians and the Palestinian issue, the real purpose of the Mapping Project is to demonize and ultimately to destroy Israel and its supporters. That's what this is about. And that's why anything that treats Israel as a normal country is regarded as evil. And that is anti-Semitic by definition. A fourth aspect. The Mapping Project links Zionism and support for Israel to a whole host of unrelated evils, what they call harms. Now you got to look, if you haven't delved into the Mapping Project, it's really worth spending some time just to look at the kinds of things that the people who put it together are mad about. They hate a lot more than Israel. Maybe they don't hate anything more than Israel, but they sure hate a lot of things besides Israel. So some of the harms that they itemize are basically, it's basically a hate list of anything that progressives and leftists are against. Imperialism, climate change, ableism, militarization, privatization, gentrification, air and water pollution. I kid you not, even, believe it or not, and this is a quote, the patenting of medicines for profit. You can find all of those and more on the list of so-called harms that the Mapping Project claims to be trying to rectify. And somehow, by virtue of their nefarious connection to Zionism, Boston's Jews and Jewish community and Jewish organizations are complicit not only in Zionism and in the evils being wrought by Israel, but also in all those other harms as well. In essence, a key theme of the Mapping Project is anything we don't like, we're blaming the Jews for. And the claim is that, at least the claim of the Mapping Project, is that if only their adherents and their supporters will dismantle Jewish groups and disrupt the Jewish community, then every bad thing will go away. Destroy the Jews and you liberate the world. Adolf Hitler said that. The Ayatollah Khomeini said that. The worst anti-Semites in history have always said that. Destroy the Jews and the world will be saved. And if you don't particularly care about the Palestinians, but you're really hepped up on ableism or on the patenting of medicines for profit, you too are welcome under the Mapping Project's umbrella of anti-Semitism. When everything you hate is somehow the fault of the Jews, you're an anti-Semite. Number 5, and this touches very strongly on what Ricky developed in detail, the connection between the Mapping Project and the BDS movement. As Ricky showed, the Mapping Project first manifested itself in words of support, messages of support from BDS Boston and from BDS Boston's local allies, and it quickly spread to other allies in the movement. And even if, as we now know, the national BDS movement, at least on paper, came out against the techniques of the Mapping Project for PR purposes, it's very clear that the Mapping Project fits hand in glove with the larger purposes of the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement. And the whole thrust of BDS, as Ricky explained in detail, and as I'm sure all of us know, is to wage economic, cultural, and academic warfare against Israel, to treat Israel as a pariah on the world stage in every area that that it can possibly be made into an alien. Its ultimate goal, obviously, is to eliminate Israel altogether. Again, Ricky gave many examples of ways in which it has expressed that message. One that she didn't mention, but that in some ways goes to the very root of it, are the words of the founder of the BDS movement himself, Omar Barghouti, who said, quote, "Most definitely we oppose a Jewish state in any part of Palestine. No Palestinian will ever accept a Jewish state in Palestine." That is what is at the heart of the BDS movement. It's at the heart of the Mapping Project. There are many, many more quotes like that, but the point is clearly this, that to the degree that the Mapping Project is related to BDS, it is anti-Semitic by definition. And that brings me finally to number 6, which in some ways is the most sinister of all and the most amorphous and timeless of all. The Mapping Project is grounded in the belief that Jews are uniquely dangerous, uniquely insidious, and that they exert a malignant influence over politicians, over the media, over police, over local governments. This is the kind of anti-Semitic conspiracy thinking that goes back to the protocols of the elders of Zion and centuries earlier. Now, some defenders of the Mapping Project have pointed out that the map includes hundreds of entities that are not part of the Jewish community. Police departments, for example, corporations, universities, Governor Baker, Senator Warren. There's even a brewery and an architecture firm listed on the map. But the point isn't that Governor Baker or Harpoon Brewery or the Bedford Police Department are Jewish. It's that Jews and the Jewish organizations and the Jewish community, one way or another, have gotten their tentacles into all of them, have figured out a way to manipulate them, have come up with mechanisms of exerting control over them. That Jews and the Jewish community and Jewish organizations are somehow responsible for getting all of these non-Jewish individuals and non-Jewish organizations and non-Jewish governments to commit all the harms that the Mapping Project lists. This plays to the oldest anti-Semitic theme of all. The conspiracy notion, the conspiracy thinking, the conspiracy theorizing that identifies Jews as the cause of whatever an anti-Semite hates the most. That's the mindset that explains, for example, why historically Jews could be blamed for communism by capitalist anti-Semites and blamed for capitalism by communist anti-Semites. It explains how Jews can simultaneously be targeted by white supremacists, like the shooter in Pittsburgh, who committed the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue, and hated by black supremacists, like the shooters at the Jersey City, in the attack at the Jersey City kosher market. This is not just prejudice. It's a derangement. The most dangerous anti-Semites of all don't regard Jews or Judaism merely as inferior, or even at all as inferior. They regard them as the embodiment of whatever they are against, whatever they are most against. This makes anti-Semitism different from virtually any other kind of prejudice that you can imagine. For millennia, anti-Semites have identified Jews with whatever in their worldview, and their worldviews can be utterly different from each other, but to the anti-Semite, what they all have in common is that whatever in their worldview is uniquely detestable or uniquely treacherous is the fault of the Jews. That's what the Mapping Project is doing. And that, above all, is why it is anti-Semitic by definition. I wrote in the Boston Globe last month that anti-Semitism flourishes in disordered and unhealthy societies, and that the United States today, tragically, is more disordered and unhealthy than it has been in a long time. The Mapping Project is a particularly ugly and alarming manifestation of Jew hatred, but let's not fool ourselves, it's not the only one out there. On both the left and the right, anti-Semitism these days is alarmingly on the increase. That's a topic for another webinar. The point is simply to underscore that these are ugly and dangerous times, and that Jews are always the canary in the coal mine. This mapping project is a roadmap for Jew haters. We have to do everything that we can to neutralize it. So I am, from the bottom of my heart, very glad that all of you, hundreds of you, are able to join us this evening, to join forces in finding ways to combat this and to neutralize it. And I'm especially grateful to Camera for bringing us all together. Thank you.